Hello, welcome once again to Urban X-Files, and today's X-File is that of vampires, the undead, and today's undead is a female that goes by the name of Sarah Ellen Roberts. Now, this strange tale is full of evidence and also full of legend. So for those of you who have not heard before, sit back and then let's see where the legend of the vampire Sarah Ellen comes from. Now, this was publicized on the media that in 1993, shortly before midnight, on the 8th of June, over 1,000 people turned up to a cemetery in Pisco, Peru, in the hope of resurrecting this said vampire that they'd found in their cemetery. Now, there's been all kinds of local historians, demonologists, vampirologists, and other historians and officials from the British Embassy, and many historians had been shocked to learn that the corpse had been brought from Lancashire, England. Now, it seems the reports say that the coffin with this vampire in was because Mr. Roberts, Sarah Ellen's husband, had been refused permission to bury his wife, who passed away. Now that might sound strange because he couldn't bury her because no one would give him permission because of the strange things that were said to have happened around this area. Now, given the fact that it was 1913, things were a little bit different back then. Now, although, let me say before I ruin the story, witchcraft and other executions had been stopped in Britain in the 1600s. I think the last one was not long after the Pendle witch trials and stuff. So anyway, I think from the 1700s at least, witches or vampires have been killed to prove their innocence that we know of. So with Mr. Roberts being refused permission to bury his lately departed wife, the story says he traveled the world looking for a place he could finally lay his wife to rest. Now, he managed to arrive in Peru, where he was allowed to intern his wife, Sarah, into sacred grounds. Now, this was for the measly sum of £5, but £5 back then, I think, was quite a considerable amount of money. Now, after the interment of his wife, Mr. Roberts had boarded a ship that was supposed to go back to England, yet he was never heard from again. Now, the news had then travelled from England that all the way to Peru in Pisco that Sarah Ellen Roberts had been bound by chains, and she'd also been put in a lead-lined coffin, and there was things like garlic and steaks and whatnot. Now, they say the legend that says Sarah threatened to return maybe 80 years, 100 years, 180 years to seek revenge for this evil act in her eyes. Now, she'd been found guilty of witchcraft, of murder and vampirism, and that is why she was interned into this lead coffin. Anyway, the Peruvian people of the town in Pisco trembled with fear at this potential vampire that lurks in their ground of the cemetery where their family members are left. buried. So some 80 years later, in 1993, people visiting the grave in Pisco Cemetery were terrified when they witnessed a crack appear in the headstone. But these reports go back and they said that the crack appeared and that it was all part of her resurrection, or or it had escaped, or whatever it be, or that the crack had occurred because the demons of the night, the devils, had come to set it free. Now, when they raised the grave of this poor lady, there was plenty of people around the town. Now, back in their town, they believed in garlic to prevent vampires from drinking your blood. So they had garlic cloves around the neck, and various other things to protect themselves, pitchforks and whatnot. Now, they got hundreds of local women left in the town in order to prevent this vampire from being resurrected, and that their newborn children and the cloves of garlic and crucifixes to put on their doors to protect the house. Now, midnight arrived, and at the peak of this vampire mania that had been reported by the police, it reached its peak, and police had to intervene with force. Shots were fired, and the crowds were dispersed, just like they did with Trump's situation, similar to that. We're obviously in Peru. Now, a small group of witch doctors who were allowed to stay at this controversial gravesite, where they treated it with holy water and done all kinds of binding spells and different things to prevent this vampire from causing havoc in this small town. Now, it says the story goes to having that Dracula's bride. How did Dracula's bride become buried in Peru? So this is now you know. Excuse me, I'm just reading the different sections I've put down. So anyway, the reality of it is that they travelled, Mr. Roberts and Mrs. Roberts travelled on merchant ships from Europe, and they docked into the port, and this is why they were given permission, because obviously he'd explained what had happened, and she died at sea, and then this is where she was prepared, and they needed to bury her. This is why he was given permission. Now, before the excuse me. Now, Mr. Roberts had been turned away by Argentina. He'd been turned away from Chile and many other places of the Americas. And then, as it happens, Mr. Roberts had practically given up hope until one of his crew members had reminded him that everybody knows Peru is the land of witches. This sailor said, without the slightest hint of jest. So this, in fact, is why the coffin made a dart for Peru. And that is how she became interned in this cemetery, and why Mr. Roberts had left and never been heard from again, which is because he was a merchant dealer. He dealt in cotton, so he was often from place to place. Now, obviously, when they exhumed this poor lady, she wasn't a vampire, or what was left in the coffin wasn't. But who's to say that it's not the bones that rise up and she's to live like 80 years in a coffin and not die. So it's a sad tale, really. So yes, there we have the story of Sarah Ellen Roberts, the vampire who came from Britain and ended up in Peru in 1913. So if you are just one of these vampire hunters, go and take a drive and take a flight over to, oh, let's scrap that bit. For those of you who want to find out more, there is plenty online about this story, and I'd just like to thank you for watching if you made it through to the end. Take care and see you for another X-Files sometime soon.